In the last video, we saw what the Stoics call good, what they call indifference, and what they mean generally by happiness. In this video, we're going to look more closely at the connections between these things, namely how it is that indifference are connected to goods, and how it is that goods are connected with happiness. The main way in which the Stoics explain the relationship between indifference and goods is using the archer analogy. The point of the archer analogy is to distinguish between the goal of an activity and the target of an activity. The goal in each case is always within your power, it's always up to you, whereas the target is out of your control ultimately, and so what happens with respect to the target is not ultimately up to you. Okay, yes, it's another distinction, but the Stoics love distinctions, and this one's actually pretty intuitive. So let's work through some examples so we can see the archer analogy in practice. In the first place, the archer's goal is to shoot well. Their target is to hit the bullseye. This is because it's within the archer's power whether or not they shoot well. It's up to them how much they concentrate, it's up to them how well they in fact perform their main activity, shooting the arrow. However, it's out of their control whether or not the arrow actually hits the target. Say someone pushes down the board at the end of the field, or say a gust of wind blows the arrow off course. This doesn't mean that the archer has shot badly. The archer could have done everything they can in order to shoot well. It just means that they got unlucky. So shooting well is within the archer's power, but hitting the target is out of their control. So being a good archer is the goal, and hitting the bullseye is the target. In the case of tennis, what's in the tennis player's power is to play tennis well. But as sports people know, no matter how well you play sometimes, you don't always win. So the goal is to play tennis well, but the target is to win the game. Now, in trying to play tennis, of course you're trying to win, but the winning isn't in your control, only playing well is. In the case of medicine, the goal is being the best surgeon or the best physician that you can be, namely making the best decisions on the basis of the patients who come into you. The target, on the other hand, is saving the patients and making them healthy. And again, as any good doctor knows, you can have an amazing day being a doctor, and yet it's not always the case that you save all of your patients. There's a sense in which then saving the patients and bringing them to health is out of the doctor's control, even though it's what their activities are aiming at. Now think about being a parent. The goal, of course, is to be the best parent that you can be, to respond well as a father or as a mother, and do the best taking care of your children. But the target, of course, is the child's well-being. What you're trying to do in being a good parent is make the child into a good person and to have a good life. But again, once more, any parent knows no matter how much effort you put in, sometimes your child doesn't turn out in exactly the way that you had hoped. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be as good of a parent as you can be. You should do everything within your power to be a good parent, even though it's not ultimately up to you how your child turns out. The Stoics also think that there's a kind of activity to being a human being, and that the goal of our being a human being is to respond rationally, because it's fundamentally in our nature to be rational creatures. So our goal is to be rational in all of our activities and to respond well in all of our activities. Nonetheless, the targets for our activities are the preferred indifference. It's things like health and wealth and having good friends. All of these things are the targets of our activities, but how we go about those is in a rational way. The reason this distinction matters so much, and why I've stressed it so much, is that the Stoics think that most people wrongly assume that their happiness consists in the things that they think are indifferent, the things that are out of their control. So people think they'll be happy if they get wealth or they get fame or they get enough popularity. But the Stoics' contribution to this debate is saying, no, 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 what happiness really consists in is in hitting your goal. You want to be the best doctor that you can be, you want to be the best parent that you can be, and you want to respond as well and as rationally to your circumstances as you can. Happiness consists in hitting your goal, but the targets are out of your control. Of course, there's a connection. Serena Williams wants to win, but what she really realizes is that what's more important is that she plays as well as she possibly can on the given day. In the same way, you're going to be aiming at lots of things in your day-to-day lives. You should try to make sure that you're in a financially good situation. You should try to make sure that other people like you. But ultimately, that kind of stuff is out of your control. What's more important is responding well. So at the end of every day, you can look back and say, I did as well as I could have. It didn't work out in all the ways I might have hoped, but I did as well as I possibly could have. So you look back at the end of every day with pride and with satisfaction about what you did, even if the results were out of your control. And an important correlate of this is that sports people at the professional level and experienced doctors don't let it get to them when what's out of their control doesn't go according to plan. For example, a good sports person will recognize that they did everything they could have to win the game, but that it's out of their control, that they didn't in fact win. They don't let it get to them. It's not that they don't care about winning, in the same way that it's not that the doctor doesn't care whether or not their patient lives or dies. Of course they care about that, but they don't let it get to them if they did everything that they could have, but they didn't get the result that they wanted. So what we're going to start to see developing in the Stoics is this kind of emotional separation. What the Stoics really care about is doing as well as you can in the situation that you're in, and you don't let it get to you when it doesn't go according to plan in terms of the effects of your actions.
An important part of the Stoic conception of rationality is that rational choices are virtuous choices. What they mean by this is that when someone is deliberating about how to respond, the way to respond rationally is in part to think about what the virtues prescribe and what the vices prohibit. So the rational response is going to take into account considerations about fairness, and it's going to take into account considerations of how other people are going to respond if you act in a certain kind of way. And so in order to respond rationally, we need to consider all of the virtuous reasons and act in the way that a virtuous person would in those circumstances. That's what it means to respond rationally, and that's what it means to respond well. Yeah, Chrysippus says life is like a running race. You should do your best to win the race. Namely, you should do the best to get preferred indifference. You should try to make money. You should try to be successful in your projects. But a good runner is also one who doesn't trip up the other runners. So in your pursuit of wealth and in your pursuit of, getting success or popularity, what you should be doing is you should be constantly paying attention to how it is that you're affecting other people. So you shouldn't undermine their projects if you're trying to get ahead. Again, good runners are ones who don't trip other people up in the race. So hopefully now you can start to see why the Stoics might think that virtue is in fact sufficient for happiness. If you think about what the life of a good doctor looks like, it can't be a life in which they never lose a patient, because that's just not a realistic conception of what it means to be a good doctor and how the life of a good doctor goes. Of course, some doctors are going to fail in improving their patients' health and in saving them from the diseases that afflict them. Nonetheless, you can still be a good doctor despite those things. A good doctor will take pride in their career if they did everything that they could to help the people who they came across, and they did everything they could to improve themselves as doctors. So in the same kind of way, we're supposed to think of our roles as human beings like this. We're not always going to get the things that we're aiming at in our projects. We're not always going to achieve the preferred indifference that most people think make life happy. But the good news is happiness is always within our power, because as long as we respond well and we respond rationally and we respond virtuously to our circumstances, regardless of what happens to us, the Stoics think that we're going to have a happy life if we respond that way. So what matters is our choices and our decisions, our actions, what's in our power, not what's out of our control. As we're going to see, especially when we look to Epictetus, there's lots of stuff in life that happens that's out of our control, and that we shouldn't think that that affects our happiness. And when we describe a human life realistically, when we describe really what it is to be a human being, we see that there are lots of things that we're going to need to overcome, but it's always within our power to respond well. It's always within our power to act virtuously. And that's why virtue is sufficient for happiness, and happiness is always within our control.